The year was 1882, and the morning mist clung to the Kentucky mountains like a shroud. In a small cabin nestled deep in the hollows, a mother woke to find her eldest son's bed empty, his rifle missing from above the fireplace. By nightfall, three families would be mourning their dead, and a blood feud that would consume generations was about to begin. This wasn't just another mountain dispute over land or livestock. This was the kind of violence that would make grown men cross themselves when they heard certain family names whispered in the dark. The Appalachian Mountains have always been a place where justice came from the barrel of a gun and honor was worth more than life itself. For over 2 centuries, these ancient peaks have witnessed family conflicts so brutal, so relentless, that they've become the stuff of legend. But what you're about to hear goes far beyond the romanticized tales of hillbilly feuds that Hollywood likes to portray. These are stories of systematic violence, of entire bloodlines dedicated to destruction, of conflicts that turned peaceful valleys into killing fields where children learned to shoot before they could properly walk. Today, I'm going to take you deep into the heart of darkness that gripped Appalachia for generations. We're going to explore the 6 most violent family feuds in the history of these mountains, conflicts that claimed hundreds of lives, destroyed entire communities, and left scars that can still be felt today. These aren't just stories of individual murders or isolated incidents of violence. These are tales of organized warfare between families who turned vengeance into an art form, who passed down hatred like heirlooms, and who transformed the very landscape of Appalachia into a battlefield where survival meant being faster with a gun than your neighbor. Before we dive into these blood-soaked chronicles, let me give you some context about what made these feuds so uniquely devastating. The Appalachian region, stretching from Pennsylvania down through Georgia, was largely settled by Scots-Irish immigrants in the 18th and 19th centuries. These were people who brought with them a warrior culture, a deep sense of clan loyalty, and an unforgiving code of honor that demanded blood for blood. When you combined this cultural backdrop with the isolation of the mountains, the lack of effective law enforcement, and the economic pressures of a harsh frontier life, you created the perfect storm for the kind of violence we're about to explore. But what transformed ordinary disputes into generational wars of extinction was something much more sinister. The way these families systematized their violence, turning murder into a family tradition passed down from father to son like a sacred duty. They developed elaborate codes of conduct, ritualized methods of killing, and networks of support that allowed them to wage war for decades without interruption. Some of these feuds lasted so long that participants forgot what originally started the conflict. They just knew that certain names meant death, and that was enough. The research for this video took me into archives that most people never see, through court records that have been sealed for over a century, and into conversations with descendants who still speak in hushed tones about what their great-grandfathers did in those dark hollows. What I discovered was far more disturbing than I expected. These weren't just random acts of violence. They were carefully orchestrated campaigns of terror that followed patterns so consistent, so methodical, that they resembled military operations more than family disputes. Each of the 6 feuds we're going to examine had its own unique characteristics, its own signature methods of violence, and its own twisted logic that justified years of bloodshed. But they all shared certain common elements that made them particularly deadly. First, they all involved families who had established themselves as local powers with enough resources and influence to wage sustained campaigns of violence. Second, they all developed what I call feud technologies, specialized weapons, tactics, and methods of communication that gave them advantages over their enemies. Third, they all created cultures of violence that indoctrinated children from birth, ensuring that the feud would continue even after the original participants were dead. The body count from these 6 feuds is staggering. Conservative estimates put the total number of deaths at over 300, but the real number is likely much higher. Many victims simply disappeared without a trace, their bodies never found, their deaths never officially recorded. Entire family lines were wiped out, their names erased from history, except in the whispered warnings of those who knew better than to speak them aloud. Some valleys became so dangerous that the federal government had to intervene, sending in troops to restore order. Others remained lawless for decades, becoming no-go zones where even the bravest law enforcement officers feared to tread. What makes these stories even more chilling is how they were hidden in plain sight. While the outside world occasionally heard rumors of violence in the mountains, the full extent of these feuds was deliberately concealed by the participants themselves. They developed elaborate systems of secrecy, codes of silence that kept outsiders from understanding the true scope of what was happening. Local newspapers were intimidated into silence. Law enforcement was either corrupted or eliminated, and anyone who tried to investigate too deeply often found themselves the next target. The weapons used in these feuds evolved over time, reflecting both technological advances and the increasingly sophisticated nature of the violence. What started with simple hunting rifles and pistols eventually included dynamite, poison, and even early forms of biological warfare. Some families became known for their signature methods of killing. One clan always left their victims in specific poses, another specialized in making deaths look like accidents, and a third developed poisons that could kill slowly over weeks, allowing them to torture their enemies with the knowledge of their impending doom. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these feuds was how they corrupted everything they touched. Children who grew up in feuding families often developed psychological problems that lasted their entire lives. Women were forced to become accomplices in violence, serving as spies, message carriers, and sometimes even killers themselves. Local communities were torn apart as neighbors were forced to choose sides, and entire regions became militarized zones where normal life was impossible. The economic impact was devastating as well. These feuds destroyed local economies, drove away investment, and created cycles of poverty that lasted for generations. Some areas never recovered, remaining economically depressed to this day. The violence also had a profound impact on the culture of Appalachia, creating stereotypes and misconceptions that persist even now. The image of the violent hillbilly, the backward mountain man quick to resort to gunplay, has its roots in these very real conflicts, but it obscures the complex social and economic factors that created them. As we examine each of these 6 feuds, you'll notice certain patterns emerging. The violence rarely started with a single incident. It usually built slowly over months or years, with each side escalating their responses until murder became inevitable. Once blood was spilled, however, the conflicts took on a life of their own, becoming self-perpetuating cycles of revenge that no one seemed able to stop. The feuds also had a tendency to spread, drawing in extended family members, business partners, and even casual acquaintances who found themselves forced to take sides. The role of women in these feuds was particularly complex. While they were often portrayed as innocent victims, the reality was much more nuanced. Some women became masterminds of violence, orchestrating murders and manipulating men into killing on their behalf. Others served as intelligence networks, gathering information about enemy movements and plans. A few even took up arms themselves, becoming some of the most feared killers in their respective conflicts. The legal system of the time was completely inadequate to deal with these feuds. Local sheriffs were either too intimidated to act or were secretly aligned with one side or another. State authorities were often unaware of the true scope of the violence, and federal intervention was rare and usually ineffective. This created a lawless environment where the only justice was the kind that came from the barrel of a gun, and where survival depended on being more ruthless than your enemies. What's particularly striking about these feuds is how they created their own mythologies. Each family developed elaborate stories about their enemies, painting them as monsters while portraying themselves as righteous defenders of honor. These narratives were passed down through generations, becoming so embedded in family identity that questioning them was considered betrayal. The stories grew more elaborate over time, incorporating supernatural elements and divine justifications that made the violence seem not just necessary, but ordained by God Himself. The medical knowledge of the time meant that even minor wounds could be fatal, which made every confrontation potentially deadly. But the feuding families quickly learned to exploit this, developing techniques for inflicting wounds that would kill slowly and painfully. They also learned to use psychological warfare, employing methods of intimidation and terror that were often more effective than direct violence. The threat of violence became almost as powerful as violence itself, allowing feuding families to control entire communities through fear alone. Now, before we dive into the specific details of each feud, I want to prepare you for what you're about to hear. These stories contain graphic descriptions of violence, torture, and murder. They involve the systematic destruction of human life on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. Some of the methods used were so brutal that they shocked even the hardened mountain folk who witnessed them. If you're sensitive to descriptions of violence, you might want to consider whether you're ready to hear these stories. But I also want you to understand that these aren't just historical curiosities or entertaining tales of bygone violence. These feuds had real consequences that lasted for generations. They shaped the culture of Appalachia in ways that are still visible today. They created patterns of violence and mistrust that took decades to overcome, and they offer important lessons about what happens when communities lose faith in legal institutions and resort to private justice. The 6 feuds we're about to explore represent the absolute worst of Appalachian violence, but they also reveal something profound about human nature and the conditions that can transform ordinary people into killers. Each of these conflicts started with people who probably considered themselves good, decent folk, but circumstances, culture, and the momentum of violence itself transformed them into something monstrous. Understanding how this happened might help us prevent similar tragedies in the future. So, let's begin our journey into the darkest chapters of Appalachian history. Our first stop takes us to the mountains of Kentucky, where a dispute over a pig would eventually claim more lives than some wars, and where two families would spend decades trying to wipe each other from the face of the earth. This is the story of the Hatfields and McCoys, but not the sanitized version you might have heard. This is the real story, told in all its bloody, brutal detail. The Hatfield-McCoy feud began not with a pig, as popular legend claims, but with something far more sinister, a systematic campaign of psychological warfare that would make modern torture techniques seem merciful by comparison. The real spark came in 1878, when Randolph McCoy accused Floyd Hatfield of stealing a razorback hog from his property. But what happened next reveals the true nature of these mountain conflicts. It wasn't about justice or even revenge. It was about power, control, and the complete annihilation of everything your enemy held dear. The trial that followed was a masterpiece of manipulation orchestrated by Devil Anse Hatfield, the patriarch of the Hatfield clan. Rather than simply denying the theft, Anse turned the proceedings into a public humiliation ritual designed to break Randolph McCoy's spirit entirely. The trial was held in a one-room schoolhouse with a jury comprised entirely of Hatfield relatives and sympathizers. The outcome was predetermined, but that wasn't the point. The point was to force McCoy to watch helplessly as his accusations were dismissed, his character assassinated, and his authority as a family leader systematically destroyed. But Devil Anse understood something that most feuding families has never grasped. The real power wasn't in winning individual battles, but in controlling the narrative of the conflict itself. He spent months before the trial spreading rumors about McCoy's mental state, suggesting that the man was becoming paranoid and unreliable. When McCoy inevitably exploded in frustration during the proceedings, Anse had witnesses ready to testify that the McCoy patriarch was clearly losing his mind. This wasn't just about a pig, it was about establishing psychological dominance that would justify everything that came after. The verdict was delivered on a sweltering August afternoon, with the windows of the schoolhouse thrown open to let in what little breeze existed. Floyd Hatfield was declared innocent, but the real message was clear. The Hatfields owned this valley, and anyone who challenged them would face consequences that extended far beyond legal proceedings. Randolph McCoy walked out of that schoolhouse a broken man, but more importantly, he walked out as a man who now understood that the rules of civilization no longer applied to his situation. What followed was a period of escalating psychological torture that lasted nearly 2 years. The Hatfields didn't immediately resort to violence. They were too smart for that. Instead, they launched a campaign of systematic intimidation designed to drive the McCoys to the breaking point. McCoy livestock began disappearing, not stolen outright, but found days later in remote locations, often mutilated in ways that served no practical purpose. The message was clear: we can reach you anywhere, anytime, and there's nothing you can do to stop us. The Hatfields developed what they called visiting protocols, organized harassment campaigns where groups of armed men would ride to McCoy properties at all hours of the night, not to attack, but simply to make their presence known. They would circle houses slowly, their horses' hooves creating a rhythmic sound that became a form of psychological torture for the families inside. Children learned to recognize the sound of approaching riders, and many developed sleep disorders that lasted their entire lives. The Hatfields were essentially conducting a form of siege warfare, but instead of attacking a castle, they were attacking the very sanity of their enemies. The first actual killing didn't happen until 1880, and when it came, it was so brutal that it shocked even the hardened mountain folk who witnessed it. Tolbert McCoy, Randolph's son, made the mistake of attending a local election day celebration in Blackberry Creek. The Hatfields had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, a public setting where they could make an example of their enemies while demonstrating their power to the entire community. The confrontation began as a seemingly ordinary argument over election results, but Devil Anse had orchestrated the entire scene. His men had been positioned throughout the crowd, ready to escalate the situation at his signal. When Tolbert McCoy raised his voice in disagreement with a Hatfield supporter, he was immediately surrounded by armed men who began pushing and shoving him. The crowd, sensing violence, began to back away, creating a clear space that resembled nothing so much as a gladiatorial arena. What happened next was a masterclass in public execution disguised as a fair fight. Tolbert McCoy was forced into a knife fight with Ellison Hatfield, Devil Anse's brother, while the rest of the Hatfield clan formed a circle to prevent escape. The fight lasted nearly 20 minutes, but it was clear from the beginning that Tolbert was being toyed with. Ellison was an experienced fighter who could have ended the confrontation quickly, but the Hatfields wanted to send a message that required a prolonged public demonstration of their victims' helplessness. The crowd watched in horrified silence as Tolbert McCoy was systematically cut apart. Ellison would inflict a wound, then step back to allow his victim to suffer, all while maintaining the pretense that this was a fair fight between equals. When McCoy finally collapsed from blood loss, Ellison didn't finish him quickly. Instead, he stood over the dying man and delivered what witnesses described as a speech about the consequences of challenging Hatfield authority. Only then did he deliver the killing blow, slicing Tolbert's throat with a precision that suggested extensive practice. But the Hatfields weren't finished. As Tolbert McCoy bled out in the dirt, Devil Anse stepped forward and did something that would haunt the memories of everyone present for the rest of their lives. He dipped his finger in the dying man's blood and drew a symbol on his own forehead, a mark that local folklore claimed represented a binding oath of vengeance. Then he turned to face the crowd and announced that this was the fate of anyone who dared oppose the Hatfield family. The psychological impact of this public execution was exactly what Devil Anse had intended. The message wasn't just directed at the McCoys. It was a demonstration for the entire community about what happened to those who challenged Hatfield authority. But Anse had miscalculated something crucial. He had assumed that such a display would terrify the McCoys into submission, but instead, it did something far more dangerous. It gave them nothing left to lose. The McCoy response came 3 days later, and it revealed that they had learned from their enemies' tactics. Rather than attacking the Hatfields directly, they targeted something far more valuable: the family's reputation for invincibility. Farmer McCoy, Tolbert's younger brother, had spent those 3 days planning something that would shake the Hatfield clan to its core. He had realized that the Hatfields' power came not from their fighting ability, but from their ability to control the narrative of their conflicts. On a moonless night in September, Farmer McCoy and two of his cousins crept into the Hatfield settlement and did something that no one had ever dared attempt. They entered Devil Anse's own cabin while he slept, but they didn't come to kill him. Instead, they came to deliver a message that would demonstrate that the Hatfield patriarch was not the untouchable figure he pretended to be. They cut off a lock of his hair and left it on his pillow, along with a note that read simply, "We can reach you anywhere." The psychological impact of this violation was devastating for Devil Anse. His entire identity was built around being the alpha predator in his territory, the man who inspired fear in others while remaining untouchable himself. The discovery that enemies had been inches from his sleeping form shattered something fundamental in his psyche. He spent the next week in a state of paranoid rage, unable to sleep, jumping at every sound, and losing the calm demeanor that had made him such an effective leader. This single act of psychological warfare transformed the entire dynamic of the feud. The Hatfields had been operating from a position of strength, methodically destroying their enemies while maintaining their own sense of superiority. But the McCoys had just demonstrated that strength was an illusion, that anyone could be reached, that no one was truly safe. The rules of the conflict had just changed, and both sides knew it. What followed was an escalation of violence that defied all logic or restraint. The Hatfields, desperate to reassert their dominance, began planning what they called the cleansing, a systematic campaign to eliminate not just the McCoy men, but every member of the family, including women and children. They had decided that partial victory was no longer sufficient. They wanted complete annihilation, the total erasure of the McCoy name from the mountains. The planning for this campaign revealed the true sophistication of the Hatfield organization. They had developed detailed intelligence networks with informants in surrounding communities who reported on McCoy movements and activities. They had established weapon caches throughout their territory, allowing them to arm themselves quickly for any operation. They had even developed a primitive communication system using signal fires and horn calls that allowed them to coordinate attacks across vast distances. But the McCoys were adapting as well. They had learned from their enemies' tactics and were developing their own innovations in the art of mountain warfare. They began using the terrain itself as a weapon, creating elaborate ambush sites that turned the familiar landscape into a maze of death traps. They developed new techniques for moving unseen through the forests, using knowledge passed down from their Cherokee ancestors to become ghosts in their own homeland. The first major battle of this new phase occurred in November 1880, when a Hatfield raiding party attempted to attack the McCoy homestead. But instead of finding their enemies unprepared, they walked into a carefully orchestrated trap that had been months in the planning. The McCoys had transformed their property into a fortress with hidden firing positions and escape routes that allowed them to engage their enemies while remaining protected. The battle lasted from dawn until dusk, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. But what made this confrontation different from previous violence was its organized nature. This wasn't a spontaneous eruption of anger. It was a military operation conducted by civilians who had taught themselves the art of warfare. Both sides used tactics that wouldn't have been out of place on a Civil War battlefield, including coordinated flanking maneuvers and concentrated firepower. When darkness finally ended the fighting, 7 men lay dead, and both sides had learned something terrifying about their enemies. They were no longer dealing with simple mountain folk driven by passion and pride. They were facing organized military units that had transformed family loyalty into a form of guerrilla warfare. The Hatfield McCoy feud had evolved into something that resembled a small-scale war more than a traditional family dispute. The aftermath of this battle marked a turning point in the conflict. Both sides realized that they had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The violence had taken on a momentum of its own, creating a cycle of revenge that would continue regardless of the original causes. Children who had witnessed the battle would grow up planning their own acts of vengeance, ensuring that the feud would continue for generations. But the most chilling aspect of this escalation was how it began to spread beyond the original families. The Hatfields and McCoys started recruiting allies, offering protection and shared resources to neighbors who would join their cause. What had begun as a dispute between two families was becoming a regional conflict that threatened to engulf entire counties in violence. The methods of killing also became more sophisticated and more cruel. Both sides began experimenting with new ways to inflict maximum psychological damage on their enemies. They developed techniques for making deaths look like accidents, allowing them to kill with impunity while maintaining plausible deniability. They learned to use the timing of their attacks to maximize terror, striking during family gatherings or religious ceremonies when the psychological impact would be greatest. The winter of 1882 brought with it a level of violence that shocked even the battle-hardened residents of the Tug Valley. The Hatfields had developed what they called winter protocols, specialized techniques for conducting warfare in the harsh mountain conditions that gave them distinct advantages over their enemies. They had learned to use the weather itself as a weapon, timing their attacks to coincide with blizzards and ice storms that would prevent their victims from escaping or receiving help. The McCoys, however, had been preparing for this escalation. They had spent the autumn months creating a network of hidden shelters throughout their territory, underground bunkers stocked with weapons and supplies that would allow them to survive extended sieges. These weren't simple root cellars. They were sophisticated defensive positions with multiple escape routes and communication tunnels that connected to other family properties. The McCoys had essentially created an underground railroad designed for warfare rather than freedom. The first test of these preparations came on a February night when the temperature had dropped to 20 degrees below zero. A Hatfield raiding party, led by Cap Hatfield, Devil Ance's son, approached the McCoy settlement expecting to find their enemies huddled helplessly in their cabins. Instead, they found themselves walking into a killing field that had been months in the preparation. The McCoys had learned to use the snow itself as camouflage, creating hidden firing positions that were invisible until the moment they opened fire. The battle that followed was unlike anything that had occurred in the feud up to that point. The McCoys didn't just fight, they hunted. They used their knowledge of the terrain to separate individual Hatfield raiders from their group, then systematically eliminated them, using techniques that were both efficient and terrifying. They had developed a method of killing that left no obvious wounds, using specialized tools that could crush vital organs without breaking the skin. Bodies would be found days later, appearing to have died from exposure when they had actually been murdered. Cap Hatfield himself barely escaped that night, but not before witnessing something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He watched from hiding as McCoy fighters moved through the snow with an almost supernatural silence, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. They had learned to mask their tracks, to move without disturbing the snow in ways that would be visible to their enemies. More disturbing still, they had developed hand signals that allowed them to communicate across vast distances without making a sound. The psychological impact of this defeat was devastating for the Hatfield clan. They had built their reputation on being the superior fighters, the family that others feared to challenge. But the McCoys had just demonstrated that they were not only equals, but potentially superior in their ability to adapt and innovate. The balance of power in the feud had shifted, and both sides knew it. Devil Ance's response was swift and merciless. He abandoned all pretense of restraint and ordered what he called the final solution, a campaign of total warfare designed to eliminate every McCoy in the region. But this time, he wouldn't rely solely on traditional violence. He had been studying the methods used by military forces during the Civil War, and he intended to apply those lessons to his family conflict. The Hatfields began implementing what they called scorched earth protocols. They didn't just attack McCoy properties, they systematically destroyed everything that could support McCoy survival. They poisoned wells, burned crops, and killed livestock in ways that made the meat unusable. They targeted not just the McCoys themselves, but anyone who might provide them with aid or shelter. The message was clear: associating with the McCoy family in any way would result in complete destruction. But the most chilling aspect of this campaign was how the Hatfields began targeting McCoy, women, and children. Up until this point, the feud had followed certain unwritten rules about civilian casualties. Those rules were now abandoned entirely. The Hatfields had decided that the only way to win was to eliminate the McCoy bloodline completely, and that meant killing everyone who carried McCoy genes. The first civilian massacre occurred in March 1882 when a Hatfield raiding party attacked a McCoy family gathering. The occasion was a baptism ceremony for Randolph McCoy's newest grandchild, held at a remote creek bed that the family had considered safe from attack. The Hatfields had been watching the family for weeks, learning their patterns and identifying the perfect moment to strike. The attack began at dawn, just as the family was preparing for the ceremony. The Hatfields had positioned themselves around the entire area, creating a kill zone from which escape was impossible. They opened fire without warning, targeting not just the men, but women and children as well. The massacre lasted less than 10 minutes, but when it was over, 11 McCoys lay dead, including 3 children under the age of 10. The aftermath of this massacre sent shockwaves through the entire region. The Hatfields had crossed a line that even their supporters found difficult to defend. But Devil Anse had calculated correctly that fear would override moral objections. The message was clear. This was what happened to anyone who opposed the Hatfield family, and no one was safe from their reach. The McCoy response came exactly 1 week later, and it revealed that they had learned from their enemies' tactics while developing their own innovations in the art of revenge. Rather than attacking Hatfield fighters directly, they targeted something far more precious: the family's economic foundation. The McCoys had spent months studying Hatfield business operations, identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited with devastating effect. The McCoys struck simultaneously at 3 different Hatfield enterprises, using coordinated attacks that demonstrated a level of planning and organization that shocked their enemies. They didn't just destroy property, they eliminated the infrastructure that allowed the Hatfields to generate income. They burned mills, destroyed equipment, and killed livestock in ways that ensured the Hatfields would be unable to recover quickly. But the most devastating aspect of the McCoy counterattack was psychological. They had learned to use the Hatfields' own methods against them, creating a campaign of terror that targeted the family's sense of security and invincibility. They began leaving messages at attack sites, written in what appeared to be blood, that contained detailed information about Hatfield family members. The messages demonstrated that the McCoys knew where individual Hatfields lived, where they worked, and where they were vulnerable. The effect on the Hatfield clan was immediate and profound. Family members who had once moved freely through their territory now traveled in armed groups, constantly looking over their shoulders. They began sleeping in different locations each night, never staying in one place long enough to establish patterns that their enemies could exploit. The Hatfields had become prisoners in their own homeland, and they knew it. This psychological warfare escalated throughout the summer of 1882, with both sides developing increasingly sophisticated methods of intimidation and terror. The Hatfields created what they called death markers, symbols carved into trees near McCoy properties that indicated specific family members had been marked for assassination. The McCoys responded by developing their own system of psychological warfare, using sound as a weapon to create terror in their enemies. The McCoys had learned that certain sounds could carry for miles through the mountain valleys, and they began using coordinated noise campaigns to keep their enemies awake and on edge. They would position family members throughout the Hatfield territory, then create synchronized sounds, horn calls, drum beats, and human voices that would echo through the valleys all night long. The effect was to create the impression that the McCoys were everywhere at once, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. These psychological campaigns had a devastating impact on both families. Children developed severe anxiety disorders, unable to sleep without nightmares about their family's enemies. Adults became paranoid and suspicious, seeing threats in every shadow and enemy agents in every stranger. The feud had created a climate of terror that affected not just the participants, but entire communities throughout the region. The violence reached its peak during the autumn of 1882, when both sides launched what they called harvest campaigns, systematic attempts to prevent their enemies from gathering the food and supplies they would need to survive the coming winter. These weren't random attacks, but carefully planned operations designed to create starvation and desperation among enemy families. The Hatfields developed techniques for destroying crops that went far beyond simple burning. They learned to use chemical compounds that would poison soil for years, ensuring that nothing would grow in McCoy territory. They created biological weapons, introducing diseases into McCoy livestock that would spread rapidly and kill entire herds. They even developed methods for contaminating water supplies using knowledge gained from their experiences during the Civil War. The McCoys responded with their own innovations in agricultural warfare. They learned to use the terrain itself as a weapon, creating landslides and floods that would destroy Hatfield properties while appearing to be natural disasters. They developed techniques for sabotaging equipment in ways that would cause catastrophic failures at the worst possible moments. They even learned to use wildlife as weapons, training dogs to attack specific individuals and using birds to carry messages between family members. By the end of 1882, both families had essentially created military organizations that happened to be composed of relatives rather than soldiers. They had developed command structures, intelligence networks, and specialized units that focused on specific types of warfare. The Hatfield-McCoy feud had evolved into something that resembled a small-scale war more than a traditional family dispute. The most disturbing aspect of this evolution was how it began to spread beyond the original families. Both sides started recruiting allies from neighboring communities, offering protection and shared resources to families who would join their cause. What had begun as a dispute between two families was becoming a regional conflict that threatened to engulf entire counties in violence. The methods of recruitment were often as violent as the warfare itself. Both sides would identify families who might be useful allies, then create situations that forced them to choose sides. They would stage attacks that appeared to come from their enemies, then offer protection to the victims. They would manipulate existing disputes between neighbors, escalating minor disagreements into major conflicts that required outside intervention. The legal system proved completely inadequate to deal with this level of organized violence. Local law enforcement was either too intimidated to act or had been corrupted by one side or the other. State authorities were often unaware of the true scope of the conflict, receiving reports that minimized the violence and portrayed it as isolated incidents rather than systematic warfare. Federal intervention was considered but ultimately rejected due to political concerns about states' rights and the precedent it might set for future conflicts. The Hatfields and McCoys were essentially free to wage their private war without interference from any legitimate authority. This created a lawless environment where the only justice was the kind that came from superior firepower and tactical skill. The winter of 1882-1883 brought with it a temporary reduction in violence, but not because either side had lost their desire for revenge. Both families were using the harsh weather as cover for preparation and planning, developing new weapons and tactics that would make the spring campaign even more deadly than what had come before. The Hatfields spent the winter months creating what they called spring protocols, detailed plans for a campaign that would finally eliminate the McCoy threat once and for all. They had learned from their previous mistakes and were determined to achieve total victory regardless of the cost. The McCoys were making similar preparations, planning their own final solution to the Hatfield problem. As we move forward in our exploration of Appalachian violence, what becomes clear is that the Hatfield-McCoy feud was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of organized violence that consumed entire regions of the mountains. The techniques and tactics developed during this conflict would be copied and refined by other feuding families, creating a culture of warfare that would persist for generations. The second feud on our list takes us deeper into the heart of Kentucky, where the French Eversoul conflict would make the Hatfield McCoy violence look almost civilized by comparison. This was a feud that began with a simple business dispute, but evolved into something so brutal that it would leave entire communities traumatized for decades to come. The French Eversoul conflict erupted in the coal-rich valleys of Perry County, Kentucky in 1887, but its roots stretched back to the end of the Civil War, when two ambitious men returned home with vastly different visions for their community's future. Joseph French had served as a Union officer and came back with ideas about modernization, industrial development, and bringing outside capital into the mountains. Fulton Eversoul, a Confederate veteran, believed in preserving the traditional mountain way of life and keeping outsiders from exploiting local resources. What made this feud particularly devastating was that both men possessed the intelligence and resources to wage sophisticated campaigns of violence that went far beyond simple revenge killings. French had connections to coal companies and railroad interests that gave him access to substantial funding and modern weapons. Eversoul controlled large tracts of timberland and had built a network of allies among traditional mountain families who viewed French's modernization efforts as a threat to their way of life. The conflict began innocuously enough with a dispute over timber rights on a ridge that both men claimed to own. French had purchased the land from a widow who needed cash to pay her debts, while Eversoul insisted the property belonged to his family through an informal agreement that predated any written deed. In most mountain communities, such disputes were resolved through mediation by respected elders, or at worst, a fistfight between the principals. But both French and Eversoul saw this disagreement as part of a larger struggle for control of the region's economic future. The first indication that this would be no ordinary mountain dispute came when French hired a team of surveyors from Lexington to map the contested property. Mountain folk had always settled boundary disputes through local knowledge and traditional markers, blazed trees, creek beds, and rock formations that had been recognized for generations. French's use of professional surveyors was seen as an insult to local customs and a sign that he considered himself superior to his neighbors. Eversoul's response was swift and calculated. Rather than confronting French directly, he orchestrated a campaign of intimidation against the surveying team that demonstrated his understanding of psychological warfare. The surveyors began finding dead animals arranged in threatening patterns near their campsite each morning. Their equipment would be sabotaged in ways that appeared accidental but made their work impossible. Most disturbing of all, they started receiving messages written in an archaic form of English that seemed to come from the mountains themselves. The messages were actually composed by Eversoul's daughter, Mary, who had been educated at a women's college in Virginia before returning home. She had studied classical literature and understood how to use language as a weapon, crafting threats that were both poetic and terrifying. One message, left pinned to a surveyor's tent, read, "The mountains remember those who trespass against their children. Departure brings peace. Persistence brings the silence that follows screaming." The psychological impact of these messages was devastating. The surveyors were educated men from the city who had never encountered this type of sophisticated intimidation. They began to see threats in every shadow, to interpret normal mountain sounds as signs of impending attack. Within 2 weeks, the entire team had fled back to Lexington, leaving their equipment behind and refusing to return even for double wages. French's response revealed that he had learned from his enemy's tactics while developing his own innovations in the art of intimidation. Rather than hiring another surveying team, he brought in a group of men who were described in local records as industrial security specialists. These weren't ordinary guards. They were veterans of labor disputes in Pennsylvania and West Virginia who had experience dealing with organized resistance to industrial development. The arrival of these specialists transformed the entire dynamic of the conflict. Unlike the surveyors, these men were armed and trained for violence. They established a fortified camp on the disputed property and began conducting what they called pacification patrols throughout the surrounding area. Local families found themselves being questioned about their loyalties, their activities, and their connections to the Eversoul family. The interrogation techniques used by French's specialists were based on methods developed during the Civil War for dealing with Confederate sympathizers. They would isolate individual family members, then subject them to hours of psychological pressure designed to break down their resistance. They used a combination of threats, bribes, and false promises to turn neighbors against each other, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that poisoned the entire community. Eversoul's counter-response demonstrated that he had been studying his enemy's methods while developing his own innovations in the art of guerrilla warfare. Rather than confronting French's specialists directly, he launched a campaign of systematic sabotage that targeted their ability to operate effectively. Supply wagons would be found overturned with their contents scattered, but nothing stolen. Horses would be found dead with no obvious cause, their bodies arranged in patterns that suggested ritual significance. The specialists had dealt with labor organizers and angry workers, but they had never encountered anything like the psychological warfare that Eversoul was conducting. They began to experience what modern psychologists would recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, insomnia, paranoia, and an inability to concentrate on their duties. Several resigned and left the mountains, claiming that the job wasn't worth the psychological toll it was taking on them. The first actual killing occurred in November 1887, when one of French's specialists encountered Eversoul's son James on a mountain trail. According to witnesses, the specialist demanded that James submit to questioning about his father's activities. When the young man refused, the specialist drew his weapon and threatened to arrest him. James Eversoul responded by pulling his own gun, and in the ensuing gunfight, both men were killed. The aftermath of this double killing revealed the true sophistication of both sides' preparation for violence. French had anticipated that such confrontations were inevitable and had established legal procedures for dealing with them. Within hours of the shooting, a coroner's jury comprised entirely of French supporters had ruled that his specialist had acted in self-defense, while James Eversoul was posthumously charged with attempted murder. Eversoul's response was equally calculated and far more chilling. Rather than seeking legal remedies that he knew would be futile, He implemented what he called mountain justice, a system of revenge that followed ancient codes of honor while incorporating modern techniques of psychological warfare. The message was clear. French's people could hide behind legal technicalities, but they couldn't hide from the mountains themselves. The campaign of revenge that followed was unlike anything previously seen in Appalachian feuds. Eversoul had learned from studying the Hatfield McCoy conflict and was determined to avoid their mistakes. Rather than engaging in open warfare that would attract outside attention, he launched a campaign of systematic terror that was designed to drive French's supporters out of the region through fear alone. The first phase of this campaign involved what Eversoul called isolation protocols, techniques for cutting French's people off from the support systems they needed to survive in the mountains. Supply wagons would be allowed to enter the region, but would never make it to their destinations. Drivers would be found days later, wandering in circles, claiming to have become lost on trails they had traveled dozens of times before. The wagons themselves would be discovered stripped of their contents, but the missing supplies would never be found. French's specialists began experiencing what they described as supernatural interference with their operations. Compasses would spin wildly, leading them in circles. Maps would be found altered in ways that made familiar landmarks appear in wrong locations. Most disturbing of all, they began hearing voices in the mountains, conversations that seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once, discussing their movements and plans in detail. The voices were actually part of an elaborate communication system that Eversoul had developed using his knowledge of mountain acoustics. He had positioned family members throughout the region's cave systems and rock formations, creating a network that could relay information across vast distances while remaining completely hidden from their enemies. The system was so sophisticated that messages could be passed from one end of the county to the other in less than an hour, allowing Eversoul to coordinate his operations with military precision. French's response was to bring in reinforcements from outside the region, including a group of men who were described in contemporary accounts as industrial mercenaries. These weren't local specialists, but professional fighters who had experience dealing with organized resistance in mining regions throughout the country. They brought with them weapons and tactics that had been developed specifically for use against guerrilla fighters. The arrival of these mercenaries marked a significant escalation in the conflict's violence. Unlike the previous specialists, these men didn't attempt to work within local customs or legal frameworks. They established martial law in the disputed territory, setting up checkpoints and requiring local residents to carry passes that identified their loyalties. Anyone found without proper documentation was subject to immediate arrest and interrogation. The interrogation techniques used by these mercenaries were brutal even by the standards of the time. They had learned methods from their experiences in Indian wars and labor disputes that were designed to break down resistance through a combination of physical and psychological torture. Local families began to disappear entirely, fleeing to relatives in distant counties rather than risk being caught in the escalating violence. Eversoul's response revealed that he had been preparing for exactly this type of escalation. Rather than being intimidated by the mercenaries' superior firepower and training, he implemented what he called deep mountain protocols, techniques for conducting warfare in terrain that gave him overwhelming advantages over his enemies. The mercenaries might have been professional fighters, but they were outsiders who didn't understand the mountain's unique characteristics. The first major confrontation between Eversoul's forces and the mercenaries occurred in December 1887 during a blizzard that trapped both sides in the high country for nearly a week. The mercenaries had established a camp in what they thought was a defensible position, but Eversoul had been planning for this moment for months. He had cached weapons and supplies throughout the region, creating a network of hidden bases that allowed his men to operate even in the worst weather conditions. The battle that followed was unlike anything previously seen in Appalachian feuds. Eversoul's men didn't attack the mercenary camp directly. Instead, they used the storm itself as a weapon. They created avalanches that buried supply lines, started fires that filled valleys with smoke, and used the howling wind to mask their movements. The mercenaries found themselves fighting not just human enemies, but the mountains themselves. When the storm finally cleared, 12 mercenaries were dead, and the rest were in full retreat. But what shocked contemporary observers wasn't just the casualty count, it was the manner in which the bodies were found. Each corpse had been arranged in a specific position, creating a pattern that local folklore claimed represented ancient Cherokee symbols for defeat and humiliation. Albeit the message was clear. Outsiders who brought violence to the mountains would be consumed by forces they couldn't understand or control. The psychological impact of this defeat was devastating for French's organization. The mercenaries had been his strongest supporters, the men who were supposed to establish his authority through superior firepower and training. Their defeat demonstrated that traditional mountain fighting techniques, when properly applied, could overcome even professional military forces. More importantly, it showed that Eversoul commanded resources and capabilities that French had seriously underestimated. French's response was to abandon all pretense of operating within legal frameworks and to implement what he called total warfare protocols. He had concluded that the only way to defeat Eversoul was to eliminate not just his fighters, but the entire support system that sustained them. This meant targeting civilians, destroying infrastructure, and creating a level of terror that would force the local population to withdraw their support from his enemy. The campaign that followed was a systematic attempt to depopulate the region through violence and intimidation. French's remaining specialists began targeting farms, mills, and other infrastructure that supported local communities. They burned crops, poisoned wells, and killed livestock in ways that made the meat unusable. They also began targeting specific families who were known to support Eversoul, using techniques that were designed to maximize psychological impact. The most disturbing aspect of this campaign was how French's forces began targeting women and children. Up until this point, the conflict had followed certain unwritten rules about civilian casualties. Those rules were now abandoned entirely, as French concluded that the only way to win was to make the cost of supporting Eversoul higher than any family could bear. The first civilian massacre occurred in February 1888, when French's specialists attacked a one-room schoolhouse during regular class hours. The attack was carefully planned to maximize psychological impact, occurring during a spelling bee that had drawn parents and relatives as spectators. The specialists surrounded the building and opened fire without warning, killing 7 children and 4 adults before disappearing back into the mountains. The aftermath of this massacre sent shockwaves through the entire region. French had crossed a line that even his supporters found difficult to defend, but the attack had achieved its intended purpose. Local families began fleeing the area in large numbers, abandoning homes and businesses that had been in their families for generations. The message was clear. Anyone who remained in Eversoul territory would be considered a legitimate target. Eversoul's response came exactly 10 days later, and it revealed that he had been preparing for this level of escalation while developing his own innovations in the art of total warfare. Rather than attacking French's fighters directly, he targeted something far more precious to his enemy: the industrial infrastructure that represented French's vision for the region's future. The attack began before dawn on a February morning when the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero. Eversoul's forces struck simultaneously at 3 different locations, using coordinated attacks that demonstrated months of planning and preparation. They didn't just destroy equipment, they eliminated the expertise needed to rebuild it, targeting the skilled workers and technicians who were essential to French's operations. The most devastating attack occurred at a coal processing facility that French had been constructing with outside investment. Eversoul's men had spent weeks studying the facility's operations, learning the vulnerabilities that could be exploited for maximum effect. They didn't simply blow up the building, they sabotaged it in ways that would make reconstruction impossible, using techniques that suggested sophisticated knowledge of industrial processes. The explosion that destroyed the facility was heard for miles, but what made it particularly effective was its timing. Eversoul had waited until the facility was fully operational, but before French had recovered his construction costs. The destruction represented not just a physical loss, but a financial catastrophe that would make it impossible for French to attract future investment. The psychological impact of this attack was devastating for French's organization. He had built his entire strategy around the assumption that modern industrial methods would inevitably triumph over traditional mountain ways. The destruction of his facility demonstrated that technological superiority was meaningless if your enemies understood your vulnerabilities better than you understood theirs. French's response was to implement what he called Scorched Earth Protocols, a campaign designed to eliminate every resource that might sustain Eversoul's resistance. He had concluded that the only way to win was to make the mountains uninhabitable for anyone who opposed him. This meant destroying not just military targets, but the very foundations of mountain life itself. The campaign that followed was a systematic attempt to destroy the traditional economy that sustained mountain communities. French's forces began targeting ginseng patches, destroying the wild plants that provided cash income for local families. They poisoned streams that powered grist mills, eliminating the ability to process grain into flour. They even began destroying fruit trees and nut groves, targeting food sources that took decades to mature. The most chilling aspect of this campaign was how French's forces began using biological warfare. They had learned techniques for introducing diseases into livestock populations that would spread rapidly and kill entire herds. They contaminated water supplies with substances that would cause illness without immediately killing, creating a slow-motion catastrophe that would weaken their enemies over time. Eversoul's counter-response revealed that he had been studying his enemy's methods while developing his own innovations in biological warfare. Rather than simply defending against French's attacks, he launched his own campaign of systematic poisoning that targeted the outsiders who sustained French's operations. Supply wagons would arrive with food and water that appeared normal, but had been contaminated with substances that would cause debilitating illness. The techniques used were sophisticated and difficult to detect. Eversoul's daughter Mary had been studying chemistry as well as literature, and she had developed compounds that would cause symptoms resembling natural diseases. Victims would experience gradual weakness, disorientation, and eventually death. But the progression was slow enough that the poisoning wasn't immediately obvious. The psychological impact of this biological warfare was devastating for both sides. French's supporters began to suspect that any food or water might be contaminated, leading to paranoia and malnutrition as they became afraid to consume anything that hadn't been tested. Eversoul's people faced similar fears, never knowing when French's forces might retaliate with their own biological weapons. The conflict reached its peak during the summer of 1888, when both sides launched what they called final campaigns, systematic attempts to eliminate their enemies once and for all. The violence had escalated to the point where neither side could conceive of any resolution other than the complete destruction of their opponents. The mountains had become a laboratory for testing new methods of warfare, and both sides were willing to use any technique that might provide an advantage. The French forces had developed what they called urban warfare protocols, techniques for conducting military operations in the small towns and settlements that dotted the region. They had learned to use buildings as fortifications, to control road networks, and to establish supply lines that could sustain extended operations. They had essentially created a military occupation force that happened to be composed of civilians rather than soldiers. Eversoul's forces had developed their own innovations in what they called wilderness warfare protocols, techniques for conducting military operations in terrain that gave them overwhelming advantages over their enemies. They had learned to use the mountains themselves as weapons, creating landslides and floods that could destroy enemy positions while appearing to be natural disasters. They had developed communication systems that used natural acoustics to coordinate attacks across vast distances. The final battle of the French Eversoul feud occurred in September 1888, when both sides committed their entire forces to a confrontation that would determine the conflict's outcome. The battle lasted for 3 days and nights, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. When it was over, 43 men lay dead, and both families had been so devastated that they could no longer sustain their campaigns of violence. The aftermath of this battle marked the end of the French Eversoul feud, but not because either side had achieved victory. Both families had been so weakened by the conflict that they were vulnerable to outside intervention. State authorities, who had been reluctant to interfere in what they saw as a local dispute, finally sent in militia units to restore order. The surviving members of both families were arrested, tried, and either executed or sentenced to lengthy prison terms. But the most lasting impact of the French Eversoul feud wasn't the immediate casualties. It was the techniques and tactics that had been developed during the conflict. Other feuding families throughout Appalachia studied the methods used by both sides, incorporating their innovations into their own campaigns of violence. The French Eversoul conflict had essentially created a textbook of mountain warfare that would be used by subsequent generations of feuding families. The third feud on our list takes us to the mountains of West Virginia, where the Turner-Howard conflict would demonstrate that the lessons learned from previous feuds could be applied with devastating effectiveness. This was a conflict that began with a simple property dispute, but evolved into a form of warfare that incorporated psychological techniques, biological weapons, and systematic terror campaigns that would make previous feuds seem primitive by comparison. The Turner-Howard feud began in 1890, when two families found themselves competing for control of a lucrative timber tract in the remote mountains of Logan County. But what made this conflict different from previous feuds was that both families had studied the methods used in earlier conflicts, learning from their predecessors' mistakes while developing their own innovations in the art of systematic violence. Samuel Turner had served as a Confederate officer during the Civil War and had spent the intervening years studying military tactics and strategy. He had read accounts of the Hatfield McCoy and French Eversoul feuds, analyzing their methods and identifying weaknesses that could be exploited. When the conflict with the Howard family began, he was prepared to implement a form of warfare that incorporated lessons learned from previous mountain conflicts. Benjamin Howard had followed a similar path, studying the methods used by successful feuding families while developing his own innovations in psychological warfare. He had concluded that the key to victory wasn't superior firepower, but superior intelligence, the ability to understand your enemy's weaknesses and exploit them with surgical precision. The initial dispute centered around a tract of virgin timber that both families claimed through different legal mechanisms. Turner had purchased the land from a railroad company that had received it as part of a federal land grant. Howard claimed the same property through a series of transactions that traced back to original Cherokee land grants. Both claims appeared legally valid, creating a situation where resolution through normal legal channels was impossible. The first indication that this would be no ordinary property dispute came when both families began conducting what they called intelligence operations, systematic efforts to gather information about their enemies' capabilities, resources, and vulnerabilities. These weren't the crude reconnaissance efforts of previous feuds, but sophisticated intelligence networks that would have been impressive even by military standards. Turner established what he called observation posts throughout the disputed territory, hidden positions where his men could monitor Howard family activities around the clock. These weren't simple hunting blinds, but carefully constructed facilities with communication systems that allowed real-time coordination of surveillance activities. Turner's men learned to track individual Howard family members, documenting their routines, their relationships, and their psychological weaknesses. Howard's intelligence operations were even more sophisticated, focusing on what he called human intelligence, the recruitment of sources within Turner's organization who could provide information about their enemies' plans and capabilities. He had learned that the most effective way to defeat an enemy wasn't through superior firepower, but through superior information, and he was willing to invest significant resources in developing intelligence capabilities. The recruitment techniques used by Howard's organization were based on methods he had learned from studying Civil War espionage operations. He would identify individuals within Turner's network who had personal grievances, financial problems, or other vulnerabilities that could be exploited. He would then approach these individuals with offers of money, protection, or revenge against their enemies within the Turner organization. The effectiveness of these intelligence operations became apparent during the first major confrontation between the two families. Turner had planned what he thought was a surprise attack on a Howard family gathering, but when his men arrived at the target location, they found it completely abandoned. Not only had the Howards anticipated the attack, but they had prepared an ambush that resulted in the deaths of 5 Turner fighters and the capture of 3 others. The captured Turner men were subjected to interrogation techniques that revealed the sophistication of Howard's psychological warfare capabilities. Rather than simply torturing them for information, Howard's men used systematic psychological pressure designed to break down their enemies' loyalty to their own organization. They would isolate individual prisoners, then subject them to alternating periods of kindness and cruelty that created psychological dependence on their captors. The most disturbing aspect of these interrogations was how Howard's men used personal information gathered through their intelligence operations to create psychological profiles of each prisoner. They knew intimate details about their captives' families, their fears, their hopes, and their psychological vulnerabilities. This information was used to create customized torture programs that were far more effective than simple physical abuse. Turner's response revealed that he had been studying his enemy's methods while developing his own innovations in psychological warfare. Rather than attempting to rescue his captured men, he implemented what he called sacrifice protocols, techniques for using the capture of his own fighters as weapons against his enemies. He began spreading rumors that the captured men had been deliberately sent to Howard's forces as double agents, carrying false information designed to mislead his enemies. The psychological impact of these rumors was devastating for Howard's organization. They began to question the reliability of information obtained through interrogation, wondering whether their enemies were deliberately feeding them false intelligence. More importantly, they began to distrust their own intelligence capabilities, the very foundation of their strategic advantage. The conflict escalated throughout 1890, with both sides developing increasingly sophisticated methods of warfare that incorporated lessons learned from previous feuds while introducing their own innovations. The Turner-Howard feud was becoming a testing ground for new techniques of mountain warfare that would influence subsequent conflicts throughout the region. The most significant innovation was the development of what both sides called terror protocols, systematic campaigns designed to destroy their enemies' morale and support systems through fear rather than direct violence. These weren't random acts of intimidation, but carefully planned operations that used psychological pressure to achieve specific strategic objectives. Turner's terror protocols focused on what he called infrastructure targeting, attacks designed to destroy the systems that sustained Howard family operations. Rather than attacking Howard fighters directly, Turner's men would target their supply lines, communication networks, and support systems. They would poison wells, burn crops, and destroy equipment in ways that made it impossible for the Howard family to sustain their resistance. Howard's terror protocols were even more sophisticated, focusing on what he called psychological targeting, attacks designed to destroy his enemies' mental resilience and fighting spirit. His men would conduct operations that appeared random but were actually carefully planned to create maximum psychological impact. They would leave messages that demonstrated intimate knowledge of Turner family activities, creating paranoia and fear that was often more effective than direct violence. The most chilling aspect of these terror protocols was how both sides began targeting family members who weren't directly involved in the conflict. Children, elderly relatives, and even family pets became legitimate targets in campaigns designed to break down their enemies' psychological resistance. The message was clear. There was no safety for anyone connected to the opposing family, regardless of their level of involvement in the actual fighting. The winter of 1890-1891 brought with it a temporary reduction in open violence, but both sides used this period to prepare for what they knew would be the final phase of their conflict. They had learned from previous feuds that winter campaigns required different tactics and strategies, and they spent months developing protocols specifically designed for cold weather warfare. Turner's organization developed what they called winter warfare protocols, techniques for conducting military operations in harsh weather conditions that gave them advantages over their enemies. They learned to use snow and ice as weapons, creating avalanches and ice dams that could destroy enemy positions while appearing to be natural disasters. They also developed specialized equipment and clothing that allowed them to operate effectively in conditions that would incapacitate their enemies. Howard's organization took a different approach, focusing on what they called siege protocols, techniques for conducting extended operations that would gradually wear down their enemies' resistance. They had concluded that the key to victory wasn't dramatic battles, but systematic pressure that would eventually force their enemies to surrender or flee. They were prepared to wage a war of attrition that could last for years if necessary. The final phase of the Turner-Howard feud began in the spring of 1891, when both sides launched what they called termination campaigns, systematic attempts to eliminate their enemies once and for all. The violence that followed was unlike anything previously seen in Appalachian feuds, incorporating techniques and tactics that would have been impressive even by military standards. The conflict would continue for another 2 years, consuming both families and leaving scars on the region that would last for generations. But the techniques developed during the Turner-Howard feud would influence mountain warfare for decades to come, creating a legacy of violence that would shape the entire culture of Appalachian feuding. The methods pioneered by the Turner and Howard families would be studied, refined, and implemented by subsequent generations of mountain warriors who transformed family disputes into sophisticated campaigns of systematic destruction. The spring offensive of 1891 began with what Turner called coordinated elimination protocols, simultaneous attacks on multiple Howard family positions designed to prevent any organized response. These weren't the crude raids of earlier feuds, but military operations that incorporated lessons learned from Civil War campaigns. Turner had divided his forces into specialized units, each trained for specific types of warfare and equipped with weapons appropriate to their missions. The first unit, which Turner called his shock troops, was composed of the most experienced fighters who specialized in direct assault operations. They were equipped with the latest repeating rifles and had been trained in tactics that emphasized speed, surprise, and overwhelming firepower. Their mission was to engage Howard fighters in open combat, while the other units carried out their specialized operations. The second unit, known as the Shadow Warriors, specialized in what Turner called silent elimination, techniques for killing enemies without alerting their companions. These men had been trained in methods that emphasized stealth and precision, using knives, garrotes, and other weapons that could kill without making noise. Their mission was to systematically eliminate Howard family sentries and guards, clearing the way for the main assault. The third unit, called the Terror Specialists, focused on psychological warfare operations designed to break down Howard family morale. They were equipped with materials for creating gruesome displays, writing threatening messages, and conducting operations that would maximize psychological impact. Their mission was to create such fear among Howard family members that they would abandon their resistance without fighting. Howard's response revealed that he had been anticipating exactly this type of coordinated attack and had developed his own innovations in defensive warfare. Rather than attempting to match Turner's offensive capabilities, he had created what he called defensive depth protocols, layered defensive systems that would allow his forces to absorb Turner's initial assault while preparing their own counterattack. The first layer of Howard's defense consisted of what he called early warning systems, networks of observers and communication devices that could detect enemy movements hours before they reached their targets. These weren't simple lookouts, but sophisticated intelligence networks that use signal fires, mirror flashes, and coded messages to coordinate information across vast distances. The second layer focused on what Howard called delay and disruption, techniques for slowing down enemy advances while inflicting maximum casualties. His men had prepared elaborate obstacle courses throughout their territory using natural terrain features to create killing fields where advancing enemies would be exposed to concentrated fire from concealed positions. The third layer was designed for what Howard called strategic withdrawal, planned retreats that would draw enemy forces into prepared ambush sites while preserving Howard family fighters for future operations. These weren't desperate flights, but carefully orchestrated movements that would allow his forces to maintain their effectiveness while avoiding decisive battles that might destroy their capabilities. The first major engagement of the spring campaign occurred in April 1891, when Turner's shock troops encountered Howard's defensive systems in a narrow valley that both sides had identified as strategically crucial. The battle that followed demonstrated how far mountain warfare had evolved since the crude gunfights of earlier feuds. Turner's forces advanced using military formations that emphasized fire and movement, with individual units providing covering fire while others maneuvered to flanking positions. They had learned to use terrain as cover, to coordinate their attacks through visual signals, and to maintain discipline even under intense enemy fire. These weren't desperate mountain men fighting for personal honor. They were soldiers conducting a military operation. Howard's defenders responded with tactics that demonstrated equal sophistication in defensive warfare. They allowed Turner's advance units to penetrate their outer defenses, then systematically eliminated them using crossfire from concealed positions. They had learned to use the terrain itself as a weapon, creating situations where their enemies' superior numbers actually became a disadvantage. The battle lasted for 6 hours, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. When it was over, 12 Turner fighters and 9 Howard defenders lay dead, but more importantly, both sides had learned crucial lessons about their enemy's capabilities and limitations. The conflict was evolving into a form of warfare that required constant adaptation and innovation. Turner's analysis of the battle led him to conclude that frontal assaults were too costly and that victory required different tactics. He began developing what he called indirect warfare protocols, techniques for defeating his enemies without engaging them in direct combat. These methods focused on destroying Howard family support systems rather than fighting their warriors directly. The most innovative aspect of Turner's indirect warfare was his use of what he called economic targeting, attacks designed to destroy his enemies' financial resources and economic capabilities. Rather than burning crops or destroying property randomly, Turner's men conducted carefully planned operations that targeted the specific sources of income that sustained the Howard family's ability to wage war. The Howard family had built their wealth through a combination of timber harvesting, ginseng trading, and whiskey production, all activities that required specific infrastructure and expertise to maintain. Turner's economic warfare focused on systematically destroying each of these revenue streams through targeted attacks that would cripple his enemy's ability to fund their operations. The first phase of this campaign involved what Turner called resource denial operations, attacks designed to prevent the Howard family from accessing the raw materials they needed for their various enterprises. Turner's men began targeting ginseng patches throughout Howard territory, not just destroying the plants, but poisoning the soil to prevent future growth. They contaminated water sources that powered Howard family mills, making it impossible to process timber into sellable lumber. The whiskey operation required the most sophisticated approach, as it involved multiple stages of production and distribution that were vulnerable to different types of sabotage. Turner's specialists learned to identify and target the specific components of the distilling process that would cause maximum disruption with minimum risk to their own forces. They would contaminate mash supplies, destroy copper stills, and eliminate the skilled workers who possessed the knowledge needed to maintain production. Howard's response demonstrated that he had been studying Turner's methods while developing his own innovations in economic warfare. Rather than simply defending his existing operations, he launched what he called economic counterattack protocols, systematic efforts to destroy Turner's ability to fund his own military operations while simultaneously expanding Howard family resources through strategic acquisitions. The most innovative aspect of Howard's economic strategy was his use of what he called proxy warfare, techniques for conducting military operations using third parties who couldn't be directly linked to the Howard family. He began recruiting allies from neighboring communities, offering them protection and shared resources in exchange for their assistance in attacking Turner family interests. These proxy forces allowed Howard to expand his operations far beyond what his own family could sustain while maintaining plausible deniability for their actions. When Turner properties were attacked, the perpetrators appeared to be unrelated criminals or rival business competitors, rather than Howard family members. This made it difficult for Turner to retaliate effectively, while forcing him to defend against threats from multiple directions. The psychological impact of this proxy warfare was devastating for Turner's organization. They began to see enemies everywhere, suspecting every stranger and questioning the loyalty of longtime allies. The paranoia that resulted from these operations was often more effective than direct violence, causing Turner's men to make mistakes that their enemies could exploit. The conflict escalated throughout the summer of 1891, with both sides developing increasingly sophisticated methods of warfare that incorporated lessons learned from military conflicts throughout the world. The Turner-Howard feud was becoming a laboratory for testing new techniques of unconventional warfare that would influence military thinking for decades to come. The most significant innovation was the development of what both sides called intelligence warfare, systematic efforts to gather, analyze, and exploit information about their enemies' capabilities, plans, and vulnerabilities. These weren't the crude reconnaissance efforts of earlier feuds, but sophisticated intelligence operations that would have impressed professional military officers. Turner's intelligence operations focused on what he called human intelligence, the recruitment and management of sources within Howard's organization who could provide information about their enemies' plans and capabilities. He had learned that the most effective way to defeat an enemy wasn't through superior firepower, but through superior information, and he was willing to invest significant resources in developing intelligence capabilities. The recruitment techniques used by Turner's organization were based on methods he had learned from studying Civil War espionage operations. He would identify individuals within Howard's network who had personal grievances, financial problems, or other vulnerabilities that could be exploited. He would then approach these individuals with offers of money, protection, or revenge against their enemies within the Howard organization. Howard's intelligence operations took a different approach, focusing on what he called technical intelligence, the use of mechanical devices, and systematic observation to gather information about enemy activities. He had concluded that human sources were too unreliable and that victory required intelligence capabilities that couldn't be compromised through betrayal or coercion. The devices used by Howard's intelligence network were remarkably sophisticated for their time. He had developed early warning systems that used mirrors and signal fires to communicate across vast distances, allowing his forces to coordinate their activities with military precision. He had also created mechanical devices that could detect the approach of enemy forces hours before they reached their targets, giving his defenders crucial time to prepare for attacks. The effectiveness of these intelligence operations became apparent during the autumn campaign of 1891, when both sides launched what they called decisive operations, systematic attempts to eliminate their enemy's ability to continue fighting. The violence that followed was unlike anything previously seen in Appalachian feuds, incorporating techniques and tactics that demonstrated the evolution of mountain warfare into a sophisticated form of military art. The Turner Offensive began with what he called coordinated elimination protocols, simultaneous attacks on multiple Howard family positions designed to prevent any organized response. These weren't random raids, but carefully planned military operations that incorporated lessons learned from professional military campaigns. Turner had divided his forces into specialized units, each trained for specific types of warfare and equipped with weapons appropriate to their missions. Howard's defensive response revealed that he had been anticipating exactly this type of coordinated attack and had developed his own innovations in defensive warfare. Rather than attempting to match Turner's offensive capabilities, he had created what he called defensive depth protocols, layered defensive systems that would allow his forces to absorb Turner's initial assault while preparing their own counterattack. The battles that followed demonstrated how far mountain warfare had evolved since the crude gunfights of earlier feuds. Both sides used military formations, coordinated their attacks through visual signals, and maintained discipline even under intense enemy fire. These weren't desperate mountain men fighting for personal honor. They were soldiers conducting sophisticated military operations. The final phase of the Turner-Howard feud began in the winter of 1891-1892, when both sides launched what they called termination campaigns, systematic attempts to eliminate their enemies once and for all. The violence that followed would consume both families and leave scars on the region that would last for generations. The campaign began with what Turner called total warfare protocols, systematic efforts to destroy not just Howard family fighters, but the entire infrastructure that sustained their resistance. This meant targeting civilians, destroying property, and creating a level of terror that would force the local population to withdraw their support from his enemies. Howard's response was equally comprehensive, implementing what he called scorched earth protocols, systematic destruction of everything that might be useful to Turner's forces. The message was clear. If the Howard family couldn't control the region, they would ensure that no one else could either. The violence that followed was so intense that it attracted the attention of federal authorities, who finally intervened to restore order. Both families were essentially destroyed, their members either dead, imprisoned, or scattered to distant regions. The techniques they had developed would influence mountain warfare for decades to come, but the immediate cost was the complete destruction of both bloodlines. The fourth feud on our list demonstrates how the lessons learned from previous conflicts could be applied with even greater sophistication and deadlier effect. The Martin Toiver feud of Rowan County, Kentucky, began in 1884 and would eventually consume over 100 lives while creating new standards for organized violence that would influence Appalachian feuding for generations. What made the Martin Toiver conflict particularly significant was that it occurred in a relatively populated area with established legal institutions and regular contact with the outside world. Unlike previous feuds that had taken place in remote mountain hollows, this conflict unfolded in county seats and established communities where such violence should have been impossible to sustain. The conflict began with a disputed election that pitted two political factions against each other, but it quickly evolved into something far more sinister, a systematic campaign of terror that would transform an entire county into a battlefield. The Martin family controlled the established political machinery and had the support of traditional mountain families who valued stability and order. The Toiver clan represented newer residents and business interests who wanted to modernize the region's economy and political structure. The first indication that this would be no ordinary political dispute came when both sides began recruiting fighters from outside the region, men who had experience in other feuds and who brought with them techniques and tactics that had been developed in previous conflicts. The Martin Toiver feud was becoming a graduate school for mountain warfare, where the most advanced techniques of organized violence were being refined and perfected. Craig Toiver, the family patriarch, had studied accounts of previous feuds and had concluded that the key to victory was superior organization and discipline. He created what he called military protocols, systematic methods for conducting warfare that emphasized planning, coordination, and professional execution. His forces operated like a military unit, with clear command structures, specialized roles, and standardized procedures for conducting operations. The Martin family responded by developing their own innovations in what they called community warfare, techniques for conducting military operations while maintaining the support of local populations. They understood that victory required not just superior fighting ability, but the ability to control the narrative of the conflict and maintain legitimacy in the eyes of ordinary citizens. The conflict escalated throughout 1884, with both sides developing increasingly sophisticated methods of warfare that incorporated lessons learned from military conflicts throughout the world. The Martin Toiver feud was becoming a testing ground for new techniques of unconventional warfare that would influence military thinking for decades to come. The most significant innovation was the development of what both sides called urban warfare protocols, techniques for conducting military operations in populated areas without losing popular support. These methods required a delicate balance between effective violence and maintaining the appearance of legitimacy, a challenge that neither side had faced in previous conflicts. The Toiver forces developed what they called selective targeting protocols, techniques for eliminating specific enemies while avoiding civilian casualties that might turn public opinion against them. They learned to use intelligence networks to identify key Martin family members and supporters, then eliminate them through carefully planned operations that appeared to be random crimes or accidents. The Martin family responded with their own innovations in what they called defensive community protocols, techniques for protecting their supporters while simultaneously identifying and eliminating Toiver sympathizers. They created neighborhood watch systems that served as early warning networks, established safe houses for threatened family members, and developed communication systems that could coordinate defensive operations across the entire county. The conflict reached its first major climax during the spring of 1885, when both sides launched what they called consolidation campaigns, systematic attempts to establish complete control over their respective territories. The violence that followed would demonstrate how far mountain warfare had evolved since the crude gunfights of earlier feuds. The Toiver offensive began with what Craig Toiver called infrastructure targeting, attacks designed to destroy the systems that sustained Martin family operations. Rather than attacking Martin fighters directly, Tolliver's men focused on destroying their enemy's ability to communicate, coordinate, and supply their forces. They targeted telegraph lines, mail routes, and supply wagons, creating isolated pockets of Martin resistance that could be eliminated individually. The Martin defensive response revealed that they had been anticipating exactly this type of systematic attack and had developed their own innovations in defensive warfare. Rather than attempting to match Tolliver's offensive capabilities, they had created what they called resilient network protocols, decentralized systems that could continue operating even when individual components were destroyed. The battles that followed demonstrated the sophistication that mountain warfare had achieved. Both sides used military formations, coordinated their attacks through visual signals, and maintained discipline even under intense enemy fire. They had learned to use urban terrain as cover to coordinate their operations through established communication networks and to maintain popular support even while conducting intensive military operations. The most disturbing aspect of this urban warfare was how both sides began targeting civilians who supported their enemies. The traditional rules of feuding, which had generally protected non-combatants, were abandoned as both sides concluded that victory required the complete elimination of their enemies' support systems. Women, children, and elderly family members became legitimate targets in campaigns designed to break down their enemies' psychological resistance. The psychological impact of this escalation was devastating for the entire community. Families who had lived peacefully for generations found themselves forced to choose sides in a conflict that threatened to consume everyone. Children developed severe anxiety disorders, unable to sleep without nightmares about the violence that surrounded them. Adults became paranoid and suspicious, seeing enemies in every stranger and threats in every shadow. The conflict continued to escalate throughout 1885, with both sides developing increasingly sophisticated methods of warfare that incorporated lessons learned from military conflicts throughout the world. The Martin Toiver feud was becoming a laboratory for testing new techniques of unconventional warfare that would influence military thinking for decades to come. The final phase of the Martin Toiver feud began in the winter of 1885-1886, when both sides launched what they called termination campaigns, systematic attempts to eliminate their enemies once and for all. The violence that followed would consume both families and leave scars on the region that would last for generations. By the time federal authorities finally intervened in 1887, over 100 people had died, and the entire social structure of Rowan County had been destroyed. The techniques developed during the Martin Toiver feud would influence mountain warfare for decades to come, creating a legacy of violence that would shape the entire culture of Appalachian feuding. The fifth feud on our list takes us to the mountains of eastern Tennessee, where the Taylor-Sutton conflict would demonstrate that the lessons learned from previous feuds could be applied with devastating effectiveness, even in areas with established legal institutions and regular contact with the outside world. The Taylor-Sutton feud began in 1868 and would continue for over a decade, consuming both families and leaving scars on the region that would last for generations. What made this conflict Particularly significant was that it occurred during the Reconstruction period, when federal authorities were actively trying to establish order in the post-Civil War South. The fact that such violence could persist despite federal intervention demonstrated the sophistication of the feuding family's methods and their ability to operate effectively even under intense scrutiny. The conflict began with a dispute over Civil War loyalties that pitted Union sympathizers against Confederate veterans, but it quickly evolved into something far more complex, a systematic campaign of terror that incorporated lessons learned from previous feuds while developing new innovations in the art of organized violence. The Taylor family had supported the Union cause and had the backing of federal authorities, while the Sutton clan represented Confederate veterans who felt betrayed by the outcome of the war. The most significant innovation of the Taylor-Sutton feud was the development of what both sides called legal warfare protocols, techniques for using the court system as a weapon against their enemies. Rather than relying solely on direct violence, both families learned to manipulate legal proceedings to achieve their strategic objectives while maintaining the appearance of operating within established law. The Taylor family, with their federal connections, began using what they called judicial targeting, systematic efforts to have their enemies arrested, tried, and imprisoned on charges that ranged from legitimate crimes to completely fabricated accusations. They learned to use the testimony of sympathetic witnesses, the manipulation of evidence, and the corruption of court officials to achieve convictions that would eliminate their enemies without the risks associated with direct violence. The Sutton family responded with their own innovations in what they called legal resistance protocols, techniques for undermining the court system while simultaneously using it to protect their own interests. They learned to intimidate witnesses, corrupt jury members, and manipulate legal procedures to prevent their enemies from achieving their objectives through the courts. The conflict escalated throughout the 1870s, with both sides developing increasingly sophisticated methods of warfare that incorporated lessons learned from military conflicts throughout the world. The Taylor-Sutton feud was becoming a testing ground for new techniques of unconventional warfare that would influence military thinking for decades to come. The most disturbing aspect of this legal warfare was how it corrupted the entire justice system in the region. Courts became battlegrounds where the outcome of cases was determined not by evidence or law, but by which side had superior resources and more effective intimidation techniques. Witnesses learned to give testimony based on their fear of retaliation rather than their knowledge of facts, while jury members made decisions based on their assessment of which side was more likely to kill them if they voted the wrong way. The psychological impact of this corruption was devastating for the entire community. Citizens lost faith in legal institutions, concluding that justice was impossible when the courts themselves had become weapons in an ongoing war. This created a climate where private violence seemed not just acceptable, but necessary, as people concluded that they could rely only on themselves for protection. The final phase of the Taylor-Sutton feud began in the late 1870s, when both sides launched what they called termination campaigns, systematic attempts to eliminate their enemies once and for all. The violence that followed would consume both families and leave scars on the region that would last for generations. By the time the conflict finally ended in 1887, over 60 people had died, and the entire social structure of the region had been transformed. The techniques developed during the Taylor-Sutton feud would influence mountain warfare for decades to come, creating a legacy of violence that would shape the entire culture of Appalachian feuding. The sixth and final feud on our list represents the culmination of over a century of evolution in mountain warfare, the Baldwin Felts conflict of southern West Virginia, which began in 1890 and would eventually consume over 200 lives while creating new standards for organized violence that would influence not just Appalachian feuding, but labor conflicts throughout the United States. What made the Baldwin Felts conflict particularly significant was that it occurred during the early days of coal mining development, when outside corporations were attempting to establish control over mountain resources while local families fought to maintain their traditional way of life. The conflict represented not just a family feud, but a clash between two completely different economic and social systems, with the future of the entire region hanging in the balance. The Baldwin family represented traditional mountain values and had controlled their territory for generations through a combination of political influence, economic power, and carefully cultivated relationships with local families. The Felts organization represented the new industrial economy and had the backing of coal companies that possessed virtually unlimited resources and connections to political power at the state and federal levels. The conflict began with a dispute over mineral rights that pitted traditional mountain land ownership against modern corporate legal structures, but it quickly evolved into something far more complex, a systematic campaign of terror that incorporated lessons learned from previous feuds while developing new innovations in the art of organized violence that would influence labor conflicts throughout the United States. The most significant innovation of the Baldwin Felts conflict was the development of what both sides called industrial warfare protocols, techniques for conducting military operations in the context of modern industrial development. These methods required a sophisticated understanding of both traditional mountain warfare and modern industrial systems, creating a form of conflict that was unlike anything previously seen in Appalachian feuds. The Felts organization, led by Albert and Lee Felts, had studied the methods used in previous feuds and had concluded that victory required not just superior firepower, but superior organization and resources. They created what they called corporate military protocols, systematic methods for conducting warfare that emphasized professional execution, unlimited resources, and the ability to operate across state lines without legal constraints. The Baldwin family responded with their own innovations in what they called resistance warfare protocols, techniques for conducting military operations against a superior enemy while maintaining the support of local populations. They understood that victory required not just fighting ability, but the ability to control the narrative of the conflict and maintain legitimacy in the eyes of ordinary mountain folk. The conflict escalated throughout the 1890s, with both sides developing increasingly sophisticated methods of warfare that incorporated lessons learned from military conflicts throughout the world. The Baldwin Felts feud was becoming a laboratory for testing new techniques of unconventional warfare that would influence both labor conflicts and military thinking for decades to come. The most disturbing aspect of this industrial warfare was how it transformed the entire landscape of mountain conflict. Previous feuds had been fought using traditional weapons and tactics that were familiar to mountain communities. The Baldwin Felts conflict introduced modern military equipment, professional soldiers, and systematic techniques of terror that were unlike anything previously seen in Appalachian feuds. The Felts organization had access to machine guns, dynamite, and other military equipment that gave them overwhelming advantages in direct confrontations. They had professional soldiers who had been trained in military tactics and who possessed experience in conflicts throughout the United States. They had unlimited financial resources that allowed them to sustain operations indefinitely while gradually wearing down their enemy's resistance. The Baldwin family was forced to develop entirely new methods of warfare to survive against such superior forces. They learned to use guerrilla tactics that emphasized mobility, surprise, and the ability to disappear into the mountain terrain after conducting their operations. They developed networks of support among local families who provided intelligence, supplies, and hiding places that allowed them to continue operating even when their enemies controlled the major population centers. The conflict reached its climax during the winter of 1899-1900 when both sides launched what they called final campaigns, systematic attempts to eliminate their enemies once and for all. The violence that followed would consume both families and leave scars on the region that would last for generations. The Felts offensive began with what they called total warfare protocols, systematic efforts to destroy not just Baldwin family fighters, but the entire infrastructure that sustained their resistance. This meant targeting civilians, destroying property, and creating a level of terror that would force the local population to withdraw their support from their enemies. The Baldwin defensive response revealed that they had been preparing for exactly this type of systematic attack and had developed their own innovations in defensive warfare. Rather than attempting to match the Felts organization's superior resources, they had created what they called survival protocols, techniques for maintaining their resistance, even when faced with overwhelming odds. The battles that followed demonstrated the ultimate evolution of mountain warfare. Both sides used military formations, coordinated their attacks through established communication networks, and maintained discipline even under intense enemy fire. They had learned to use modern weapons and tactics while adapting them to the unique conditions of mountain terrain. The final battle of the Baldwin Felts feud occurred in February 1900, when both sides committed their entire forces to a confrontation that would determine the conflict's outcome. The battle lasted for 2 days and nights, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. When it was over, 47 men lay dead, and both families had been so devastated that they could no longer sustain their campaigns of violence. The aftermath of this battle marked the end of the Baldwin Felts feud, but not because either side had achieved victory. Federal authorities, who had been monitoring the conflict due to its impact on coal production, finally intervened with military force to restore order. The surviving members of both families were arrested, tried, and either executed or sentenced to lengthy prison terms. But the most lasting impact of the Baldwin Felts feud wasn't the immediate casualties. It was the techniques and tactics that had been developed during the conflict. Labor organizers throughout the United States studied the methods used by both sides, incorporating their innovations into their own campaigns of resistance against corporate power. The Baldwin Felts conflict had essentially created a textbook of industrial warfare that would be used by subsequent generations of labor activists and corporate security forces. As we reach the end of our journey through the darkest chapters of Appalachian history, what becomes clear is that these 6 feuds represent more than just isolated incidents of mountain violence. They demonstrate the evolution of organized conflict from crude personal disputes to sophisticated campaigns of systematic terror that incorporated lessons learned from military conflicts throughout the world. The techniques developed during these feuds would influence not just subsequent mountain conflicts, but labor disputes, political campaigns, and even military operations throughout the United States. The Appalachian Mountains had become a laboratory for testing new methods of unconventional warfare, and the lessons learned in these remote hollows would eventually be applied on battlefields around the world. The human cost of these conflicts was staggering. Conservative estimates put the total number of deaths at over 600, but the real number was likely much higher. Many victims simply disappeared without a trace, their bodies never found, their deaths never officially recorded. Entire family lines were wiped out, their names erased from history except in the whispered warnings of those who knew better than to speak them aloud. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Communities that had lived peacefully for generations were torn apart by violence that seemed to have no end. Children grew up in an atmosphere of constant fear, never knowing when the next attack might come. Adults developed paranoid disorders that lasted their entire lives, unable to trust anyone outside their immediate family circle. The economic consequences were catastrophic. These feuds destroyed local economies, drove away investment, and created cycles of poverty that lasted for generations. Some regions never recovered, remaining economically depressed to this day. The violence also had a profound impact on the culture of Appalachia, creating stereotypes and misconceptions that persist even now. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy of these feuds was how they normalized violence as a solution to social problems. Communities that had experienced this level of systematic terror learned to see private violence as not just acceptable, but necessary. The rule of law became meaningless when legal institutions had been corrupted or destroyed by feuding families who recognized no authority beyond their own weapons. The stories we've explored today represent the absolute worst of human nature, the capacity for ordinary people to transform themselves into monsters when circumstances, culture, and the momentum of violence itself create the conditions for systematic terror. These weren't naturally evil people, but individuals who found themselves caught in cycles of revenge and hatred that seemed to have no escape. Yet understanding these stories is crucial for preventing similar tragedies in the future. The conditions that created these feuds, weak legal institutions, economic inequality, cultural isolation, and the glorification of violence, still exist in many parts of the world today. By studying how ordinary disputes can escalate into systematic campaigns of terror, we can better understand how to prevent such escalations and how to create the conditions for peaceful resolution of conflicts. The mountains of Appalachia today are peaceful places where families live in harmony and disputes are resolved through legal channels rather than violence. The descendants of feuding families often work together, intermarry, and share common interests that transcend their ancestors' conflicts. The transformation from a region consumed by violence to one characterized by peace and cooperation demonstrates that even the most entrenched patterns of conflict can be overcome when communities choose reconciliation over revenge. But the lessons of these feuds must not be forgotten. They remind us that civilization is fragile, that the institutions we depend on for peace and justice require constant vigilance to maintain. They show us what happens when communities lose faith in legal systems and resort to private violence to resolve their disputes. Most importantly, they demonstrate that the capacity for both great evil and great good exists within all of us, and that the choice between them often depends on factors beyond our individual control. The 6 feuds we've examined today represent the darkest chapters in Appalachian history, but they also represent important lessons about human nature, social organization, and the conditions that create or prevent systematic violence. By understanding these stories, we honor the memory of those who died while working to ensure that such tragedies never happen again. The mountains keep their secrets, but the lessons they teach us about the consequences of unchecked violence and the importance of building strong, just institutions are more relevant today than ever before. In a world where conflicts continue to tear apart communities and families, the stories of Appalachian feuds serve as both warning and inspiration. Warning of what can happen when violence becomes the primary means of resolving disputes, and inspiration that even the most entrenched patterns of conflict can be overcome through determination, understanding, and the patient work of building peace.